Death by 1,000 cuts is a figure of speech that refers to a failure that results from many small problems instead of one big one. However, working in the male-dominated workplace, most of us will encounter it as a tactic used by an adversary where they launch a series of small strikes against us. Over the course of my career, my teams and I have been on the receiving end of this tactic many times, and I've witnessed the mistakes most of our workplaces will make that only serve to perpetuate the situation and make it worse. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to respond to an adversary who uses death by 1,000 cuts so we get them to stop. Death by 1,000 cuts follows a scenario. Our adversary launches a small strike against us. We get upset and think, what are they doing this for? Our natural instinct is to not let them get away with it, so we fire back with a proportional retaliatory strike. At this point, we have to understand that the male-dominated workplace follows the third law of physics, which says, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So when we give a proportional response, we confirm to our adversary that we follow this law. This alleviates their biggest fear, that we'll respond disproportionately and hurt them. They carefully chose the size of their offensive strike because they knew they'd have to withstand this size retaliatory strike. The third law of physics also gives our adversary permission to keep their attacks going. They see our reaction as an action against them, which they now have to react to with their own proportional retaliatory strike, which we then see as an action against us that we must react to. This creates a back and forth tit for tat, and we don't realize how we're getting hooked on the drama and neglecting the work we should be doing, until someone comes along and says, "What are we doing? This is stupid. Let's get back to work." This interruption shocks us into seeing the reality of our situation. We realize their strikes aren't doing serious or lasting damage. By the time they launch strike number 10, the first 5 have already been resolved. And we realize that what makes death by 1,000 cuts effective is how we let it distract us from doing our work. Because if they really wanted to hurt us, they would need to launch bigger strikes. And this makes us wonder, what are they really up to? We know that by following the law of action and reaction, if they launch a big strike at us, then we would respond with an equally large strike. And that's what they're afraid of. This tells us that they see themselves as inferior, and their real objective is to be a nuisance who distracts us from doing our job so we fall behind or fail at it. If they can succeed in doing this, then they'll knock us down a few notches and reduce the disparity between us. And that's the real objective. We realize that death by 1,000 cuts is a dysfunctional and cowardly tactic that our adversary is using in order to avoid their real issue. And we don't want to play their game, so we decide it's time to change the game. The first change we make is to stop engaging in the tit for tat. Instead of reacting to their strikes, we assign someone to clean up after their strikes while everyone else goes back to work. This takes all the drama out of the situation that kept us engaged. Now that we're not reacting to their strikes, our adversary feels ignored and even more powerless. So they step up their strikes, hoping for a reaction, which we don't give them. Instead, we wait patiently because we know, in their desperation to get our attention, they'll make a mistake. Their mistake crosses a line and requires us to launch a disproportionate retaliatory strike that hurts them, and even worse, damages their pride. But they can't show that, so to save face, they also launch a bigger strike. But this time, we don't react. Instead, we flex our power and give them a choice. Do they want us to react, or do they want to sit down and talk? It's up to them. By demonstrating our strength and resolve not to play their game, we open the door to negotiations and resolution. Unfortunately, many of our workplaces won't reach the point of resolution because instead of flexing their strength to stand up for themselves, they'll let their fear of conflict guide all their actions. Our adversary knows many people have a fear of conflict, and that's exactly what they're counting on. They know some people will run and hide right after the first strike is launched, including senior managers who hope distance will protect their position. Our adversary hopes their strike creates chaos and confusion. They know there's a risk of a rash actor having a disproportionate reaction, but they count on everyone else's fear of escalating the conflict to hold him back. Our fear of conflict causes us to engage in the prolonged tit-for-tat our adversary wants, and they know it will lull us into thinking we're creating a managed stalemate and blind us to the reality of how we're slowly weakening ourselves. It's our own fear of conflict and fear of flexing our strength and standing up for ourselves that will ultimately do us in. And that becomes the moral of the story of how death by 1,000 inconsequential cuts can take down even the strongest of teams. This is Dot Callahan asking you to help me turn the woman in the room into the women in the room. Sign up for my newsletter, subscribe to my YouTube channel, or find the woman in the room on Facebook. It's up to you. Just keep watching and sharing my videos to get advice from a woman who's been there, dealt with that, and knows what works.